Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and please do welcome none other than Mustafa Suleyman, of course, who can dig into all things ethical AI. I want to give a quick update. I know you've lost your train of thought, having overdosed on some of the French delicacies outside. Remember, I want you on your phones, I want you tweeting, #STYT, but also we want you asking questions, and we want you to interact with our poll that we're about to have. So get your phones out. Of course, it is stytbloomberg.com. And I'm going to ask the audience a question before we dig into things. Do you think tech giants now realize their ethical responsibilities? Do you think yay or nay? Currently, many think there's still a way to go. Not everyone, but they're not saying yes outright. So it looks as though we get to work on this. And let's get your point of view, because Mustafa, you're a fascinating man in the respect that from DeepMind's creation, you were thinking about the ethical consequences of AI. And it seems to be coming home to roost now. Suddenly everyone else is singing from your hymn sheet as well.
I think we still have a long way to go before we're anywhere near the sorts of AI that you heard about in the introduction. I mean, artificial general intelligence is, I'm sure, many, many decades away. But the much more narrow, applied, practical AI is around us all the time. And whilst we at DeepMind set out on a mission primarily to develop more general purpose learning algorithms, right from the outset when we founded the company in 2010, the strapline for our business plan was safe and ethical AGI. So it is, it's exciting to see so many people now talking about ethical AGI, and that really is the most important question of our day. These systems influence us, they persuade us, they nudge us, they reframe the choice architectures that govern what we choose to buy, where we choose to go, who we connect with. And that's a profound effect on our society that we have to start thinking very, very seriously about.
Can you talk about some of the real applications already that we're seeing in terms of the negative consequences? We talked earlier with Nicholas Zentrum about the issues of building bias into AI. What are the key challenges, do you think, that need to be avoided?
Well, I think the important thing to remember is that any of these systems are going to be a product of the values of the people who design them, even if you didn't explicitly encode your values into that system. Simply your blind spots or the judgments that have driven your hypotheses when you come to put a set of recommendations together actually inform how the system evolves. The kind of training data that you use to shape the algorithm, to push it in a particular direction, the kind of objective function, what are you asking the algorithm to predict? All of those are really important decisions that have very fundamental knock-on consequences much further down the line when these systems go into production. So it's really important that as designers of these algorithms, we try to think about their consequences way ahead of time and don't wait for a kind of iterative experimentation in practice as we observe their effects on real people.
You're thinking about it. How do you, from a very practical point of view, think about it within DeepMind and as a wider organization, Google?
Well, we've made it a principal kind of element of our culture right from the outset. In every company retreat, whenever we have a town hall, whenever any of us as founders give talks, our leadership team constantly restate the importance of putting ethics at the heart of our decision-making process. And that really helps to make it okay for the rest of our staff to put their hand up when they see something that they're concerned about, when they want to ask a difficult question of management. That's a natural and inherent part of our culture. So that's one way of making it the kind of go-to of the way we behave.
You've brought it into your company, as you say, from day one in the tagline. What about the conversations you're having with governments, regulators? Is this something that other companies are automatically going to be thinking about, or is it something that perhaps they have to be forced to think about?
I think the difficulty is there are many, many well-intentioned people in a lot of the bigger technology companies, and they are often looking to do the right thing. And I think often people will say that the law of unintended consequences had resulted in this unforeseeable negative effect, maybe months or even years after a piece of technology has been put into production. And I do have some sympathy for that approach, but I'm also uncomfortable with that being the end of the discussion. You know, the truth is, we have to adjust as an industry. Silicon Valley in general has to change its culture from one of tossing half-baked things over the fence and letting the crowd, if you like, dog food it, you know, chew it up and try to improve it, and then improve your product in this iterative way, this agile development methodology, which has been inherent to, you know, technology's culture. We have to shift away from that approach towards one where we're being much more sensitive and much more proactive to the potential consequences. And that means testing in simulation, rigorously thinking through the ethical consequences, inviting other anthropologists, sociologists, civil society representatives into the companies right at the heart of the development process to help think through some of the potential consequences which may arrive further down the line.
Does that slow the whole process? Do we have to realize that perhaps technology companies become slightly less nimble?
I think it will slow the process to some extent, and that's nothing to be worried about. That's a healthy and safe and ethical way to develop technologies. We already do it with respect to privacy, for example. There are enormous and very well-developed practices, you know, essentially driven by the requirement to comply with the law, which take place before you release any product in one of the big technology companies. And in general, that happens really very effectively. So I think we have to improve that framework and also now introduce a set of broader ethical principles, key questions that are asked before a piece of technology is put into production. And we're quite capable of, the industry is quite capable of doing that. It shouldn't be too difficult.
So it's self-regulation, really, should be the answer.
I think that's one significant component. Self-regulation at least is about changing the culture of internal inquiry, ensuring that there are many more diverse voices at the table at the time when we design products and when we test products. And after we have tested them and they're already in the wild, we continue to monitor their use and how they're being misused, if you like, and how the unintended uses are emerging. And we have to proactively monitor for those. But I certainly don't think self-regulation is enough. I think it's one key component that we need to work on now. And I think ultimately much more robust forms of conventional regulation are going to be necessary.
Is that something you're working with governments about? I know you've worked with Theresa May of the United Kingdom to look at partnering on AI. Is that the discourse you have?
Yeah, I think it's important that as technologists, we you know, directly raise the questions that we have. We essentially try to create more of a semi-permeable membrane around the technology that we're developing. We invite criticism in proactively. That needs to be the culture that we shift towards. And in doing so, that will help us to sort of raise sensible suggestions to governments and to regulators and to policymakers that are measured and appropriate and are actually relevant to the specific technologies that we're all working on. Because the risk often, I think, is that sometimes regulators are not just behind the curve, but they don't really have a very good understanding of the actual technology that's being developed. Even if they're given access to the core code, they don't have the competency to make sense of it. And so I think it's incumbent on us to try to proactively help them to understand what this actually means and what the potential consequences might be.
Let's talk about the technologies that you work on, what they actually mean, the ramifications they're already having. We've got a question from the audience saying, you train your AI with data coming from already structured knowledge, particularly with healthcare, this seems to be aimed at. They say you're going to consumers, to patients, rather than to healthcare professionals and the industry players. How are you looking at working with healthcare? How is AI already being used within the healthcare sector? And what have you already had to perhaps learn and nuance to ensure that it's building for good?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the excitement and the rush to deploy AI, lots and lots of people are trying to find, you know, novel applications that make a real difference in the world. Partly, as I said earlier, because everyone's very well intended and wants to really make a difference. And there are lots of cool applications that will really transform healthcare, improving the accuracy and consistency of radiology diagnostics, for example. I mean, this is one that many, many different companies are working on. I think the challenge that we have at the moment is that the training sets, the input data that is used to teach the algorithm what positive and negative diagnoses actually are, those training sets are quite small at the moment, and in many cases they're quite poorly labeled. So often a set of engineers are essentially taking a set of text labels and trying to apply them retrospectively to the images, rather than identifying the specific pixels or voxels in an image which correspond to the diagnosis, much like a human would. And so one of the things that we've worked very hard on is 3D optimal coherence tomography, 3D eye scans. And we're really trying to label each individual pixel rather than a gross image. And that's to try and make the algorithm much more like a human diagnosis rather than one of the supervised classifiers that we've so far been developing, which are essentially much more crude.
So there is clear work within the healthcare sector that you're doing and nuances that you're doing to ensure that it works more like a human. What other sectors are you finding the most low-hanging fruit at the moment and that perhaps need to embrace AI and the ethical questions around it faster than the others?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, there's a difference between the sort of low-hanging fruit and the desirable problems that we would really like to solve in the world. Yeah. I think, there's a new wave of technologists coming up now who principally want to solve the hard problems that matter in the world. Transportation, food, housing, healthcare, diseases, energy. And we're very much in that camp. But the challenge in that camp is that many of those sectors have very poorly digitized systems and very poor training data. So that's one of the difficulties of operating in that space. And that's why many of the machine learning applications that have been successful in visual image recognition, in speech recognition, have been in the existing sort of consumer tech spaces, with some exceptions. We've been working particularly on energy. We think there's a lot of opportunity to train systems to run big industrial control systems much more efficiently, like heating, lighting systems for big buildings, or running data centers, for example, which consume vast amounts of energy, or even national grids. The challenge there is that these are big, old industrial systems. They take a long time to work with, and often the data is quite poor, so that demands much more of our algorithms.
What about, there's an interesting question from the audience, from Christian, saying, how can AI actually help the collaboration within certain industries? So whether it be the startups to work with the governments, to work with the NGOs, to solve problems like climate change. Is there a way that artificial intelligence can draw all those people together to then ensure that you're working on the right sort of problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a big role for government to play in supporting the startup scene, in creating spaces where you can essentially, with some subsidy, run your startup from. I think that's a really important component, because I think what a lot of people don't realize is that the lead time to going from startup to developed algorithm to deployed and regulated algorithm is much longer than I think you might first anticipate. Once you have a medical diagnosis algorithm that looks like it's performing reasonably well, the amount of testing and safety that you have to go to before you can even deploy in a real-world context in order to get regulatory approval is really long, and that will require much more sort of innovation on the government and regulatory side to create safe containers where that kind of experimentation can take place and that testing can take place that isn't actually in production.
Has France been doing that? You've just brought a team to Paris. This is a country that seems to be investing in AI.
Yeah, I think so, and we're very excited about Macron's support for the sector. We obviously believe that this is the future, and we think there's enormous benefits to come from advances in AI. It is clearly a national priority, and I think all governments should be investing in this. If anything, we've long been talking about investing in the digital economy and collecting lots of data and digitizing our public services. Well, in order to extract any meaningful knowledge or insight from that data, one has to have good machine learning algorithms, and they need to be accountable, they need to be transparent, they need to be controllable, and so there are all kinds of challenges to how you actually get digital technologies and specifically machine learning to work in practice in communities.
It's interesting that obviously some of the ethical questions arise within the individuals themselves building the AI and who they're building them for. We talk about the governments. Government defense areas have wanted to employ AI. How is that something that you within DeepMind talk about who the customer is at the end of the day and how you build the appropriate AI for where you want it to go in the longer term?
I think that's pretty challenging. When we were acquired, we made it a requirement of our acquisition that our technologies wouldn't be used for weapon systems or indeed for surveillance. And we've been very clear and public about that for the last 4 years since our acquisition. That's obviously the position that we continue to hold, and we think it's an important stance that needs to be upheld. We know that our technologies are dual use or multi-purpose, and many people will repurpose them for all kinds of other uses that we may or may not agree with morally or ethically, and that is sort of inevitable. Nevertheless, we think that we have to try to do as much as we can on our side to put technologies out there in the world which are designed for specific, positive, good uses in mind, and try to restrict them to those sorts of uses. And that's what we've been committed to since we founded the company. What
about the interesting nuances using, well, we heard in the video before where AGI goes. Elon Musk has been brought up the concern of having robots control things, machine control things, and AI become larger than we can control. Do you think that's a concern?
Yeah, I mean, Elon was one of our first investors, so we've known him for quite a long time, and I obviously respect him as a businessman. He has quite incredible achievements under his belt. I do think that some of his predictions are a little bit far-fetched, to put it lightly. And I actually think, to be quite honest with you, he's doing a bit of a disservice to the real ethical issues that we're facing. Really? I think AGI is a very long way away, many decades away. And, it's all well and good to have a philosophical conversation about what might potentially, happen in a very abstract sort of dystopian way. And we should certainly spend some time thinking about those questions. But there are many more urgent, near-term, practical issues which affect us every single day.
Like?
Well, I mean, take, for example, the fact that, our transport systems, increasingly everybody is using maps for navigation, and that is driving traffic to one street over another, and there are significant environmental and social consequences to those decisions. At the moment, I would say, compared to the existential risks of AGI, those consequences are quite modest, but nevertheless they're real, and they are opportunities for us to experiment in coming to collective consensus between companies, civil society groups, and governments and regulators to try and figure out how we together decide how we move traffic around our cities. And that would be a good example of a collaboration that could have a lot of positive benefit among our cities. And there are many other examples that are just like that.
You mentioned before about changing the culture of Silicon Valley, and I wanted to bring up a chart of one of the cultures that many people feel is the real and present issue, and it's that of diversity. It's that of the lack of diversity. I showed it in an earlier talk about how much over the years from 2007 to 2017, we have not budged in terms of our ethnicity, in terms of the diversity within technology in particular. Can AI help with that, certainly unravel some of those biases that seem to be creeping in?
No, I personally feel this diversity question very strongly, and it's something that really troubles me. I know that the vast majority of our developers are male, and many of those are white. And I think what we urgently need is much more representation of the kinds of sort of communities and customers that we're actually building these products for, just so that we can actually design these systems with a much more diverse collective set of interests and values in mind when we actually build the systems in the first place. And I am overall very optimistic about AI having the potential to, in the long term, be much more fair, much more systematic in the application of a clear set of values that we all sign up to, provide individuals with much more feedback and control and scrutiny over the data that's held about them and the decision that is taken on them. So for example, at the moment, or maybe a few decades ago, when you were turned down for credit or for insurance by your bank manager, you may only get a very simple one-line explanation, if anything, and there may be a whole series of horrible judgments that sit underneath that decision. I would like to think that in the future, we're certainly not there yet with AI, but in the future, there's the potential for our systems to be much more explainable than the human brain, the human, sort of biases and judgment that come with our personalities. And that represents an opportunity for us to build systems that have our highest set of collective values imbued in them from the outset and be much more fair and just.
How important is another question from the audience of the role of open public data, the movement there in delivering AI for good? How has that unleashed some of the things that you can work upon?
I think it's been really beneficial. You look at maps, for example, and we need a lot more sort of open public data, and that will really support the startup community and allow some of the bigger technology companies to build much better products that will be much more useful. And I think a whole series of protections and controls will need to come from that. And I think more than ever, we need engineers and senior technologists employed full-time in government departments to be responsible and technically capable interlocutors. We need a human API at the kind of regulatory and civil society end to make sure that the public interest is also protected. And I think it's incumbent on the technology companies to take proactive responsibility for protecting the public interest when we deal with all kinds of data, both private and open public.
Are the companies thinking about this?
I think there's been a shock to the system. I think, trust has taken a real battering in the technology companies over the last 12 months. And I think a lot of good, well-intentioned people in Silicon Valley are waking up and realizing that, perhaps they've been operating in a little bit of a bubble for a while, and that there's a lot of, frustrated and concerned consumers, maybe the silent majority, who haven't, voiced that frustration in a very, clear way so far. And I think things are going to start to shift. I think we're going to see a real profound shift in the extent to which the technology companies act with humility and take real responsibility, proactive responsibility for the ethics of the products and services that we build.
What can we do as the consumers or as the silent majority? Is there anything we can do to ensure that these future technologies are built in the way that we'd like to see them developed?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we all actually pay attention to the terms of service. We understand who has our data, for how long, under which terms, what rights I have over that data, what rights I have to an explanation about the algorithms which are generating predictions which are shaping my life. I think we have to be aware of those things and actively participate, because that voice is listened to, and it does need to be even louder than it is and even clearer, and that will play a really important role in helping shape our technology companies and our products and services for the better.
And in the next 12 months, as you say, there will be a shift in the technology companies. What can we expect from you in the next 12 months? What food for thought can you leave us with as to what we should be, where the real work of what DeepMind is doing will suddenly hit us in the face?
Well, I think we've obviously been publishing a lot of incredible stuff, and I think looking at the slate of what's coming out in the next 3 or 4 months, there are some really exciting real-world application results that we've got coming out. But I think the other thing is we're thinking hard about governance and oversight. What is the right construct for formally involving independent experts and representatives of civil society in our day-to-day working process. We've already experimented with this in a couple of ways. With our healthcare efforts, we have a panel of independent reviewers, 9 technical experts, clinical, and academic, policy, civil society experts who come and scrutinize us in the public interest. They can talk to any of our staff. They can interview our teams. They can, check out all of our infrastructure. They can see our confidential product roadmaps. And we've done that essentially on trust. And that has worked so far really, really well. They're just about to issue their second annual report, giving a sort of critical feedback on how we've been. And so we're starting to look at that and figure out how we can scale that up and apply it to other areas.
Here's to governance. Mustafa, it's been wonderful having you here. Thank you so much indeed. Do give it up to Mustafa Suleyman, the co-founder of DeepMind.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank
It's
you.
wonderful.